All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Now, obviously, just give us a second here. We're gonna blast out all the links for the show. We've missed a couple of weeks now, and that's because we're all busy. All right, you guys don't pay us enough to do this full time. All right, we're all doing our own thing. But let's just blast these links out real quick,
You
and
know,
then we'll get
I, w-
started.
I had finals. But guys, I'm officially a Bachelor of Science in Economics. So, in other words, everything I say is absolutely correct and unassailable. I'm basically the god, the demigod of economics now. So,
Yeah, that's true. A bachelor, a BS or a BA.
BS.
Okay, that's how you know it's a real one. All
Summa
right.
cum laude, okay? 3.99, 4.0 in major. I made an A minus, 92.8.
3.99. Wow. Cringe.
I had a
Unbelievable.
I made a 92.8 in my intermediate Chinese class. Not because it was a hard class, but because I was lazy and I was overconfident. And I rued that day for forever because at graduation they say stand up if you got honors in major, so I stood up. Stand up if you got summa cum laude, I stood up. And then stand up if you got a 4.0 GPA. And there was like 10 people who stood up in the entire stadium. And I was like, oh my God, I could have been one of two people in the economics department, which made a 4.0, but I didn't. I fell short.
Yeah, in my experience, that is frankly that is the hardest part about getting a 4.0 is that you it's kind of luck in some sense, right? Like you have some professors who it's like when you submit a paper, like is this going to be an A? Like it kind of depends on the professor. What does the curve look like? Like it's just kind of, I don't know. You have to get kind of lucky. I mean, it's mostly hard work that results in a 4.0, but there's a plus or minus 1% of luck that is injected into your GPA. Unfortunately.
There's some professors that are just bad. Um, Now, I've never been in a class where only like 2% made A's. In most of my classes, at least 10% of the classes made an A. So that's given me like an opportunity. It hasn't been ridiculous. Um, but I would say that don't be lazy, guys. Okay. If you're early undergraduate, keep your GPA up. I know I was originally planning on doing a PhD in economics, so I knew my GPA mattered. Whenever I applied to law school, my GPA helped a lot. I know a lot of people don't go into school intending to go to graduate school, so they don't really care about their GPA as much, and that really reduces your flexibility once you graduate, and you don't
Indeed,
want to
it
reduce that
does.
flexibility.
All right, hold on. I forgot one last thing to blast. I forgot about the Twitter.
Yeah,
I'm
I
out
was
of
waiting to
practice,
retweet it.
guys. All right, the tweet is live. Just I'll quote tweet it.
Okay, based.
All right, all right. Oh shit.
Yeah, we're so sorry that we've been gone for so long. I take zero responsibility and put all the other blame on the other two hosts, like a
That's
responsible
true.
person.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, I mean it's all independently all three of our faults, it's hard to determine the marginal responsibility of any particular consequence, as any good economist would tell you. But anyway, guys, well, let's go ahead and get started. We've already blasted all of our shit out, so hopefully everyone's able to join us as people start to trickle in. Welcome. Of course, Three Wonks is a policy-focused podcast, in theory, with a socialist host and a liberal host and a social democratic host. But as Micah said, I've drifted to the left, and STL's not with us, so we've drifted the whole podcast to the left somewhat. On average, I guess we still see a social democratic middle ground between Micah and myself. But anyway, thanks for joining us, guys. Today we're going to talk about Micah and his paper that he submitted. I don't really, I mean, I saw that a paper was submitted. I don't know who it was submitted to or what the situation is. Micah's graduating from college, obviously, and part of graduating, I guess, was he had to, or I don't know if he had to, but part of the option is you have to write a thesis if you want. And I think that's what's went down here. Is that about right, Micah? And what was the thesis about?
So I needed to get one extra credit to graduate, and I had the option of like just doing a whole other course, doing like some BS training thing for one credit. And I was like, you know what? There's a topic that I want to research, which no one has ever published any research on before. And so I asked the school, hey, can I do an independent research project? And they were like, that sounds really cool. I got a professor to do it with me. That professor actually ended up leaving like almost immediately. So I had no advisor. So I did this pretty much alone, but it was a very interesting experience. And I made some discoveries along the way. Now, the idea is called election by jury. And it touches on a subject that we've spoken a lot on this podcast about, which is sortition, randomly selecting people, creating a little microcosm of the public. But instead of using that, that assembly of randomly selected people to make decisions about policy or make recommendations about policy, as has happened many times around the world and is currently happening in places like Paris, I'm recommending that we actually use this in the context of elections. And so maybe we can talk about that a little bit. Do you have any thoughts about this?
Well, I have one thought from the top rope. SDL joining us a little bit late. He's sunken down on his camera angle. It's just his head.
That's right.
That's all right.
It symbolizes my
SDL,
descent from this podcast. Go ahead.
What is your excuse? Why are you late? The people were waiting for their socialist king.
Look, I just love my family, love family values. Don't you love family values? I can't believe I'm being canceled for loving my family
SDL.
too much.
All right. No, we were talking about Micah's paper that he's submitting. So, Micah, it sounds like what you're saying is you want to have juries that elect representatives instead of having, the juries do policy directly. A little bit of representative sortition, some might say.
Right. Basically. So the idea is this. There's plenty of positions in the government which are supposed to be independent and nonpartisan, but they are elected usually through partisan elections today, or nonpartisan elections that are really partisan. So let's think about district attorneys, right? District attorneys should prosecute crimes whether they're done by government officials of their party or not, right? We like them to be independent. What about clerks, the people who administer elections? What if we could have a process to elect these people? Now, my proposal in election by jury is actually to elect all people through this system, just because I like to be radical and extreme, because that's more interesting. But the argument for the process is this. It's hard to judge election outcomes in terms of their quality, right? You can't say that the current system chooses bad candidates. I mean, we can all subjectively say that, but like in terms of social science research, people don't usually like to say things like that, because that means you need some sort of evaluative criteria to determine what outcomes of elections are good and bad. And that is sort of controversial, right? We're utilitarians. We say electing Trump was objectively a bad choice. A lot of elections are pretty nuanced, right? So you can make plausible arguments either way. So here's the methodology I use. Instead of like judging election quality by the outcomes they generate, why don't we look at whether there's a presence of certain decision-making criteria that are necessary for good decisions or not? For instance, can we expect voters to make good decisions in an election if they don't know any information about the candidates? I cite the example of an ice cream parlor in my paper. Imagine going to an ice cream parlor, you're given a menu, there's random obscure names which are assigned to each ice cream flavor, and you don't know like what they correspond to. There's no visual aids. You're just given basically a list of random words, and you're asked, make a good decision about like choose the ice cream you most prefer off this menu. You probably couldn't be expected to do it consistently. You might get lucky, right? You kind of randomly choose. And then you get your Rocky Road, because that's what you wanted. But like very frequently, you would make decisions that are out of line with your preferences. And so, well, it turns out voters, they don't know almost any information about the candidates they're voting on, right? They don't know any biographical details. They don't know what their policies are. They don't know what the consequences of those policies are. They don't know basic civics about what the position even does. But then there's a second issue, which is there's this notion of the miracle of aggregation, which is, look, it's okay if most voters don't know what they're talking about because they make random errors. So like the uninformed voters, sometimes they randomly vote Republican, sometimes they randomly vote Democrat, and they offset each other. And the 10% of voters that like kind of know what's going on, they're the ones who determine the election. That's a great theory. It's awesome. I love it, except it's just not true in practice because uninformed voters don't make random decisions. They skew one way. All the research which came out about this last election shows that if you're an uninformed voter, your likeliness of voting for Trump or voting for the Republican Party is dramatically increased. And it's not just in terms of partisan preferences and candidate preferences. We see that uninformed voters have tons of opinions about the world that are skewed, right? So they tend to think about things that are more zero in a more zero-sum way. They tend to be more obsessed with the thought that the world's getting worse and the past was better. They tend to be really anti-foreign, right? Anti-trade, anti-immigration. There's large bodies of research which go back decades, which have shown this. And so like, this is actually a serious problem. And so my proposal is, okay, well, maybe we can't inform all these people. We actually see that research which shows that if you try to expose people to new information, it's really not effective at changing their opinions. And people have confirmation bias, which is, even when they do research, usually they're tethered to their original opinions. They don't really care about information which conflicts with their pre-existing views. They mostly receive information which confirms their existing views. So we have this issue, like this issue in the voting population is almost unsolvable. So my proposal is, okay, what if we can create these deliberative mini microcosms of the population and put them through a procedure which makes them very informed and makes them much more open-minded and much more rational. Maybe then we can expect these people to make better decisions than the general public can under the existing system.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying is, what if we got a bunch of random people and put them through the woke mind virus education, and then all of a sudden they would do things that agree with you, Micah? Not surprising.
So true.
No, I mean, literally, that's what people would say about this proposal, obviously. I mean, I don't know to what extent your paper gets into the practicalities of, how to educate these people or like what that process would look like. I guess that's a very logistically intensive thing to think about, especially with all of these different elections that we do have to vote on, right?
Well, I don't think it's as big of a deal as people say it is, right? Because even if you just made this microcosm spend more time on this issue without any sort of like moderators or educators, you could just literally bring them into a room, have the candidates give speeches and distribute materials to them that follows some basic rules, right? They can't lie or make like insane unsighted claims in these packets, right? They distribute these packets. Everybody has an opportunity to talk about it. There's basically no third-party education or moderation. These voters would still know infinitely more about the candidates and be infinitely more primed to make a non-biased decision than our existing voters, because the existing voting base is so uneducated and so closed-minded.
SDL, sounds like you were about to say something.
Well, there's plenty of things to talk about here. I have not read your paper yet. I don't think you sent the text to us just yet. But one of the classic suggestions I've heard is to do a 2-stage lotocracy. The first stage is just pure random selection, right? It's jury trial with no removal from the jury. That jury then creates the test for the second stage lotocracy, and then those people would have that's either the test or the informational materials would be set by the first stage. I don't know if that's what you get into your paper, but basically, how do you square the question of what information to give voters? Well, maybe let voters decide what information to give voters. I don't know if there's compounding problems of that sort of, if voters are uninformed and biased, do they just create uninformed and biased materials, or does the process of creating that inform them in the way you're suggesting by giving them campaign materials and so on?
Yeah, the difficulty is you have to teach them how to make good materials in the first place. Pretty much every lotocratic system, for instance, in British Columbia, they convened one to consider alternative voting systems to first past the post. They had a long education process for that. And they brought in people that were advocating all manner of systems. In the end, they recommended single transferable vote. It was a recommendation, so it wasn't binding. So it never actually was implemented. It got passed with 59% of the vote. The threshold was 60%.
That's so funny.
That's really depressing, honestly, because now they still have first past the post. But you need some sort of education process. I just don't think that this is as big of a deal as people like to say it is, right? So there's this notion that we can never expect anybody to be impartial ever when it comes to the administration of these things. Well, what are judges, right? Judges have a code of ethics. Judges, we tend to think, are reasonably impartial. What if we have a jury select the administrator for this system, and there's a binding code of ethics, and there's tons of transparency. There's cameras everywhere. What if the set of materials made to prime people for voting in an election are standardized and used for every time like that kind of position goes up for a vote, right? So like we don't have to make a new packet every time there's some sort of district judge election. We just have a standardized packet, which explains like really, really impartial facts about the courts, the same kind of facts that we expose people to in the public education system, right? I don't think it's an impossible thing to a barrier to get over.
No, I just wondered if your paper discussed some of these like second order questions of how do you decide the education portion of basically the project, right? Like I think it's a very interesting claim, the idea that you could basically set a bunch of people down, you can intensively focus the beam of deliberative democracy on them, and then maybe they'll come to better conclusions than the general public, who that beam is much more diffuse and weak for, because there's a million times more of us in the general population. I think it's a very interesting claim. I guess there were, when you were speaking, I wrote down two more things to get to. One was just, I did want to push back slightly on the persuasion argument. I think that around the mid 2000s, there was a lot of pushback on the idea that you could persuade people. Like I remember reading studies about what's it called? The backfire effect, that you try and persuade people of something, they actually end up going the opposite way. Or you try and persuade people and there's very motivated partisan reasoning. But since like 2018 or so, I've seen just this bevy of studies come out that basically systematically destroys that. Like the backfire effect is not real. It occurred in one subject, the Iraq War, and it didn't replicate across like 63 other domains. So it's like, oh, well, that's just fake, right? Similarly, one last thing, there was a study which investigated partisan motivated reasoning, and it found that like there is an effect, but it's relatively small. Like the persuasion effect, let's say, is half a standard deviation, and the partisan motivated reasoning was like a tenth of a standard deviation. So real, but not enough to mean that persuasion can't occur.
Let's be clear. My claim actually is that persuasion can occur within a controlled environment. So we see that there's an entire there's a book that I read on this. It's linked in my annotated bibliography, guys. My Substack, will link it in the description. It's about how the origin of human rationality is actually as a communication and conflict resolving device. So that's part of the reason why we have confirmation bias. Like we have rationality to convince other people to do what we wanted originally. But we find that in contexts where people are forced to engage in debate or deliberation, they're able to recognize arguments that are better than their own, and they're able to change their mind. But if you leave them isolated and they're just making decisions by themselves, there's a lot of studies which show that they're just like systematically irrational. So you give, for instance, people like logic questions, right? They'll look at a set of answers. There'll be the answer that's most intuitive to them, and they really struggle, even if they look at it for a long time, to leave the question that first intuitively made the most sense to them, even after considering the question for a very long period of time. And whenever you put those people in groups, right, and they're able to expose arguments to each other in the same amount of time, you see that they're way more likely to get right. People are not stubborn. People change their mind when they're in groups and they're able to deliberate. And so you also see that like they've done like spatial mappings of these things, and it's like the people who get it correct first get the people that are next to them to get it correct, and then it like contaminates. So the people that were farthest away from everyone that was correct were the last ones to get it correct. So like correct,
it's the woke mind virus,
right?
but
like correct views proliferate, right? And it's like, okay, well, this is incredible. We just need people to deliberate. Now we see that people that do research like independently, voters in our actual system, they're not engaging in high quality deliberation. You'd really struggle to find any evidence that's actually occurring. Insofar people are engaging in communication over electoral politics, they're mostly doing it with people they agree with, right? It's part of the reason why social media has, in some sense, made things worse, because people are able to select for people that disproportionately agree with them, or select for the people they disagree with in like the worst way possible, right? Like insofar they see the other side, they see the worst of them, like their viral tweets of being very confrontational and bad.
There is a lot of evidence around that there's sort of a double siloing and negative polarization that occurs in social media, where you get people who have your exact same politics, not quite like this podcast because we do disagree with each other, but like the average person is in a very tight bubble, or can be if they want to be in one. And they can also, the only time they ever need venture outside the bubble is to see like the dumbest person who disagrees with them, who's also super toxic. And the reason they're getting at is because one of their friends in their bubble is pointing out, this is the dumbest person I've ever seen. And so your exposure is simply people who love you and have perfect views, and the dumbest, most evil, ontologically terrible people who disagree with you. And that, of course, makes you think that you're right about everything, which is a bad
And that's why
situation to be in.
deliberation can be very effective. And we see it as very effective at changing people's minds, right? So there was a study that was done in the United States that took 40 Republicans, 40 Democrats, and like 20 independents and put them in a room. And they polled what their views are on a variety of highly salient issues like the minimum wage and climate change before the deliberation, then after the deliberation. And we find that Democrats had a much more nuanced understanding of like monopsony and the fact that the minimum wage cannot be set at an unlimitedly high level. And then Republicans left to understand that climate change was a big issue. Now you could say, well, the education process was clearly just super biased, and like we could never possibly recreate this in any sort of sense that was like, immune to bias. But I beg people to understand that the existing system is super bad, right? Like the existing system is extremely biased. The information that people are exposed to has almost no relation to the truth, right? It's all like campaign ads. How good of a quality of education do you think campaign ads are? Well, the reality is the average voter doesn't even know the contents of those campaign ads because they're not even paying attention when they're happening. That's like the only access to education they get in the first place. Insofar they get external information, it's mostly from extremely partisan media environment. This is like a terrible way to prime people to make important decisions, right? And that's part of the reason why we have such bad electoral outcomes, I'll say subjectively. And if you want to judge how bad electoral outcomes are, at least you can determine that things are swinging very wildly. It's very strange. If our election system is good at producing something that like accurately portrays our preferences for outcomes, why the hell are we getting completely different policies all the time? Things are completely flip-flopping. That doesn't make very much sense.
Well, Micah, I
will
was just gonna
say,
Micah, have you considered one of the issues I have in some fundamental sense with the sortition bros of the world is that I don't know. I feel like oftentimes the sort bros. Yeah, I feel like oftentimes they look at the worst examples of democratic institutions, essentially, which is the United States, right? And that's almost undeniably the case. And they don't necessarily compare sortition to what appears to be the very best systems of democracy, what we might think of like pure proportional representation, like the Netherlands. It seems like those systems, insofar as they tend to actually be representative of the median person, it seems like the radicalization of those people's politics and the instability of what we might think of as basic policy goals, right? Like quality public education, healthcare systems, things like that. It doesn't seem to be nearly as high in those countries that actually have good representative democratic institutions.
Well, go ahead, STL.
No, that's exactly what I was going to say. When you measure, one way of estimating how good elections are is how much people like the outcomes. And people like the outcomes. They trust democracy much more, like 30 points more in proportional representative systems than first past the post. So that said, I think the point Micah would probably raise in response is there are still polls of political knowledge of people in proportional representation parliamentary democracies, and they're still really bad. Like the median person knows very little. I will say that some studies that have been done at least will find that people in systems with a lot of parties are fairly good at figuring out attitudinally which party is closest to them. Like they have something like a 9 in 10 chance of figuring out the closest party. That's a really low bar because that just means they pick the closest party, not that they have good reasons for doing so, right? Like there's a
So part of the reason why these systems work better is because they reduce the amount of information that people have to make judgments on, right? So you're making judgments on parties and not candidates. Candidates are much less important, and it's much easier to understand the policies of parties than candidates. There's also
hold on, really quick. Based, hello, idolatry is bad.
Yeah, well, they also like that's part of the reason why like the only if we didn't have D or R on like ballots, then our voting behavior would literally be random. Like it would literally be insane, or it'd be prejudicial. We see that there's huge patterns of preferences, especially within primaries, of people based on their racial demographic. So the perceived racial demographic of the candidate predicts certain demographics voting behavior, which is like really unfortunate, actually. It's a great example of the fact that people have racial biases that still are very much present in our society. But I would say that it reduces the amount of information that people have to make judgments on, but clearly not enough for them to make wise judgments. I mean, think about the weight of a decision of voting, right? You are voting. Let's say that your vote was actually decisive, right? You're choosing the policies that your country operates on. Maybe you know some of the policies that the parties are putting forward. Do you know their consequences, right? Voters' actual behavior or preferences are not for the policies intrinsically, right? People are not like, oh, I just value raising the minimum wage because the minimum wage, like as a matter of like deontology, like it ought to be this way. No, like they want the world to be better in certain ways, right? And people have their own different preferences for what is a good world. But there's a desired end state, and there's a preference that you articulate in voting in terms of which party will bring about us closer to that end state. You need to understand the consequences of policies in order to be able to articulate that preference properly and align with your actual the outcomes that you actually want. No one's educated on policy. Like we are somewhat educated on policy. Still, we don't fully understand the full scope of all the policies differences between the elected officials that we're asked to vote on. Like whenever I vote for judges, do I really know about the different theories of jurisprudence and their different attitudes? Go ahead.
We've spoken about this before, though, right? Where like it. So number one, it seems like all three of us don't believe in that many elections, right? Like it seems like what all three of us would believe in is like people should be voting on way less shit. Right. Like it seems like there's a lot of things that should be sort of technocratically appointed by representative bodies. Like, you know, I don't know if any of us are necessarily that much in favor of things like elected district attorneys or elected judges and stuff like that. Like maybe at a certain high level, it could make sense. But like when it comes to like, OK, like there's a local community college by me. The local community college has at-large elections for their school board. Like why are we electing the local community college school board? This is bizarre to me.
There is somebody
right?
who said though, like this is a response to the fact that voters are so uninformed, right? Like would I prefer for elected officials to appoint the district attorney responsible for investigating them, or would I prefer a jury to select this person? I would prefer a jury to do that, right? Because you want a DA that investigates the county commissioners if they're corrupt, right?
Yeah, of course, right. But again, when we were talking about just kind of transitioning all these things into sortition bodies, like it to me, just a hybrid approach makes the most sense. Like you said, okay, well, maybe when it comes to appointing like the internal investigator of the police department, we would just have a jury do that instead of having an at-large election. Like that makes a lot of sense to me. But when you talk about like all representatives should be selected this way, it just sounds like, to me at least, when I look at the evidence of the best democratic institutions available to us, it seems like people selecting parties, like you said, based on some kind of like loose preference and ideological preference of those parties, that seems to work out decently well, in part just because, especially if we have closed list systems, you have that sort of technocratic sorting in the first place, right? Like you have, for instance, like you look at the UK, and a lot of conservatives in the UK grumble about this. They're like, oh, this is bullshit. We got this brown guy as the leader of the Conservatives. We got this black woman as the leader of the Conservatives. What the fuck? We got all these people of color and gay candidates and shit. But the party just kind of ignores that and says, look, I mean, it's a closed list system. We think these people are the most qualified, and that's what we're going to go with. Vote for fucking the Labor Party if you have a big problem with it. And it seems like that's like a good sorting process, and it seems to result in pretty good outcomes. Now, I'm not discounting what you're saying about, oh, well, at the end of the day, the voters still aren't very informed. But at the end of the day, society at large isn't very informed in your system. It's just like the individual juries themselves, right? So I don't know if there's a big difference between like technocratic body sorting in closed list systems versus sortition to juries that are slightly more informed from a deliberative process, right? Like, do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I do understand what you're saying. I do think there's a big difference. And I listen, as a practical matter, I do not advocate that we start electing the president via jury. Right? It's just not a practical proposal at all.
Cringe.
Right? So like hybrid is necessary to have any sort of buy-in in a democratic society. But the question about whether like these like parliamentary systems with, you know, proportional representation are optimal and we can't do better. I certainly think we can do better. I mean, you look at all these countries, there's still like a huge bevy of flaws, right? So like we look at a very narrow cast of democracies when we say like these are the ones that are really working well. We exclude plenty of countries that have proportional representation that still are making bad choices. Like look at Germany. Germany has a lot of problems, and the AfD is doing better and better, and they have proportional representation.
The,
In
the big
Norway-
difficulty is like so. Just I will readily concede many parliamentary proportional democracies have bad outcomes. The difficulty is that we're trying to evaluate the counterfactual. I don't know that jury systems would produce results too different. Like that's the critical claim that's harder to prove, right? And so when we talk about like epistocracy in the United States, if you were to weight votes as Jason Brennan has supposed, by how much people know about the election on these sort of basic questions of what does the position do, who's running, what are their positions, then the results you'd get would be different, but they're not going to be like 20 points different. They'd be like 3 points, 5 points different. That's all.
I think that the biggest change is not necessarily in just looking at electoral outcomes where you assume like, well, the parties are the same and they're making the same, making very close choices to the votes, to the choices that the general population would make. I think the entire system changes whenever you have only juries electing people. Now, like the entire incentives of politicians to do things that just look popular, right? To hold these bullshit hearings, all this stuff, it goes down dramatically, right? Because whenever their judgment day doesn't come in front of a popular audience, which is like rah rah rah, like looking at clips on Twitter, it comes in the form of a jury which sits there for like 5 months to look at all this shit, right, and study it really thoroughly.
So, Micah, I have a question though.
What's that?
What is the compare it to epistocracy? That's an interesting question. Is like what's the advantage of having a jury system versus like a knowledge weighting voting system like what Brennan recommends?
There's two big differences. First, a knowledge weighted voting system doesn't actually accurately represent all the different constituencies within society, right? So like there's working class people, right? There's certain racial demographics and ethnic demographics that have less knowledge. They're just not represented in this system as much as other groups.
Partition is more woke is what you're saying.
Yeah, of course. But like the question is, okay, well, do these different groups have different sets of preferences that need to be articulated in your system? And it's like, well, almost certainly yes. For one reason, one possible reason is maybe people have preferences that relate to their own lives, right? So like it's like the selfish voter theory. They vote in ways that benefit themselves, and other voters vote in ways that benefit themselves. Now, I don't think that theory is actually correct. We look at voting behavior, and it seems like people actually are voting in what they think is the best interest of society. That's where the second theory of how this can be biased comes in. People's perception of what is best for society is very different based on their demographic and position within society, right? So like people that are richer, people that are benefiting more from existing institutions are less likely to want dramatic reforms, right? They tend to be much more interested in keeping things the way they are. And other people may be more interested in change. I think it's important to have proportional representation of all the groups in society. I think that all else equal, that's an advantage. And the second difference is even if your voter is knowledgeable, they can pass a civics test. They know who Thomas Jefferson and George Washington is. They know what the deficit is. Guess what? They don't know the detailed, intricate knowledge necessary to make the best decision in the election that they're tasked with. They don't know the details of all the platforms. They don't know the research on the effects of the specific policies in question. So I think that a generally informed voter will still make a worse decision than a hyper-informed, maybe less educated voter, if you were to compare them.
Yeah. Sure. So you're drawing a distinction sort of between information about a specific position versus general political knowledge, I think is the argument you're trying to provide.
Yes.
So this is a local knowledge type problem. And so maybe the closer you can get people to only having to focus on this problem and incentivizing them to do so to get the correct position, you maybe can get better outcomes, which I think is an interesting one. So that leads to the funny suggestion. Again, I sort of hinted at it earlier of a two-stage autocracy where you first have autocracy, but then you weight them by their knowledge and you use them to select a second autocratic body based on that epistocratic weighting, and then use them to do the deliberative democracy. And now you've not only weighted for general society knowledge, but you've got the deliberative benefits in there. I don't know. I feel like there's some funny way to get like lotto, techno, fudo, what's the third one? Technocratic. You get this weird quadruple system.
I think there's something to be said about having most legislative processes done by juries themselves. And you still need elections for certain positions like judges, like district attorneys and like executives, right? Because you're going to have mayors or you're going to have city councils that elect mayors. Actually, I think all chief executives should be selected by like a deliberative body below them, like a city council, like a legislature. I don't think that we should have a president. I think that we should have a prime minister, because the dictatorial risk of a prime minister is just dramatically lower, right? The UK is not going to have a dictator. Why? Because they keep removing the leader of their party like every year. It's just impossible to consolidate power like you can in the United States.
So I will say on this one, so I was looking into this recently, and there's a decent amount of literature now on the sort of presidential versus parliamentary question for whether there's a higher risk of what we would call democratic decline, which is you reduce the quality of democracy in your country. Maybe you make electoral democracy weaker, you weaken people's freedom of speech and so on. And there doesn't actually seem to be a statistically significant correlation once you control for a few other things, like the wealth of a country, how large their government is, how independent their military is, like a few other things. Once you control for that, a lot of this appears. But one of the things that does seem to persistently arise in a lot of these studies is actually how large parties are. There seems to be a big problem of concentration of political power. You're seeing an example of this in the United States. Even though the United States has a two-party system, both of our parties are actually very large by world standards. Like our smallest party in the federal government only has 47% of the vote in the Senate, right? That's our smallest party. In other countries, that could be like 2% in like the Netherlands, and the largest party might be like 20%. So we are in a really bad situation because one party in our system can take majority control of every single institution because it's able to be that large. Trying to pivot this back to your paper, I do think there's a benefit of autocracy in that it's less likely to be innately partisan politics. And if your system has more autocratic elements, you're less likely to have these large parties that completely dominate people's opinions and maybe therefore less risk of takeover. Like regardless of president versus parliament, it's unlikely that a autocratic system would also be like 60% diehard Republicans, hopefully.
Well, I think, in this autocratic system, if you took it to its most extreme level, you just don't have partisan politics in the first place. The entire institution of like polarizing propaganda doesn't exist because there's no incentive for it to exist anymore, or at least there's a dramatically reduced incentive. And so if you ever have, let's say, a dictatorial person, right? You have like a crazy mayor or something like that, or somehow you get a president. I'd advocate for a prime minister, but prime minister, president, whoever, your chief executive becomes authoritarian, starts arresting people or whatever. People are not polarized in such a way that, and there's no media apparatus to justify that, right? Like right now, the mayor of Newark got arrested, right? What do all the Republicans do? Yes, this is great, right? Under the system, if you just see somebody getting arrested and you have no partisan affiliations, you're probably like, well, that's very disturbing, right? Because like this whole political system, I guess, is you're more isolated from it. Now, some will say, well, Micah, people aren't as civically engaged. I tend to think to the extent that people are civically engaged and involved in the political process, it's actually probably leading them to have worse behaviors rather than better ones.
Well, this is, to me, what I think is the greatest concern I have of a solely autocratic system. Suppose that we live in a system like that we advocate for, with fewer elected positions, such that you're only electing, like, let's call it a county legislature that's like 50 people. You're only electing like a state legislature that's like 200 people. You're only electing a federal legislature that's like 500 people. Relatively small number. So let's say you're doing 1,000 elections in your life. You're adding in like judges and some other stuff Micah might want to keep. So that's going to be a relatively small portion of people from every given community. Your chances of having to use your political knowledge are fairly small. Like in a given year, it might be like 2%. And this might lead, unironically, to less civic engagement. Now, you're right that a lot of civic engagement today is bad, but I don't know that there aren't better ways. I don't know that it's possible to have a better system where people could still be regularly civically engaged. The reason why this concerns me is I think that people don't enter into the autocratic system as blank slates, right? They don't enter in, simply take account of the evidence and come to their views. I think people are persuaded in percentage points, but it's going to be like persuasion of 5-10 points at maximum. If you have a society overall that has very absurd, crazy views, like imagine an 80% creationist society, well, you're not going to take the autocratic system and get them on board of like evolution, right? It's just not going to happen.
I think my theory is, I think the view you're putting forward is, well, people, because they're civically engaged in the existing system or any system like it, they're going to come in with a better understanding of the world, so that the autocratic system has less educational work to do. I think insofar that the vast majority of people have political knowledge, it's wrong. And it's like really wrong, right? So like if you come in and you don't know anything about climate change, right? Let's say that happened under the system. I think people would still know about climate change, even if there wasn't a civic process. But if you came in and you knew nothing, that would be preferable than 40% of people coming in believing that it's absolutely fake, right? Like it is easier to move people from a blank slate to a correct opinion than to move a large section of the population from an extremely wrong, entrenched opinion to a correct opinion.
Sure, I'm just not sure. Like, I think there's this trade-off essentially. If you imagine a purely laudocratic system, you will have more people who are low information, and possibly less people who are high misinformation. That's sort of what you're getting at. Like, there will be fewer people who inform themselves because their vote just doesn't matter. Like, right, it just literally doesn't matter. But there are also maybe fewer people who get misinformed because votes don't matter. So therefore, there won't be immediate apparatus incentive to misinform them.
I mean, who is actually high information, really? Like, look at even the very informed voters, in terms of informed. They know about partisan politics, right? They know about Trump's impeachment and the Russia Gate and all of that stuff. Does anybody know about actual policy or substance? Like, very
Sure, it's
few
much
people
rarer,
are
yeah.
actually informed in any way that's actually useful. You ask the average very, very high propensity Democratic voter or Republican voter, what is the budget deficit this year? What are the consequences of that? What does Medicaid do? Most people don't know they know almost nothing that's useful. So I think you overestimate the civic benefits of people being involved. But here's a counterpoint. I don't think that the ideal democratic society is one in which people are never asked to vote. I think they should be asked to vote on referendums. I think that is a useful thing for people to be involved in.
Well, this is what I was going to get to, is that if your problem, and I generally agree with this, is that people often vote for partisan reasons, and a lot of politics is the personal, it's gossip, it's just sort of Republicans good, Democrats bad, or vice versa, which is not productive. It doesn't add to people's knowledge. Well, one way is to try and shift politics towards that of issues, like shift them towards referenda. But something else you could do, like we talked about this previously, you could just pay people, like let's say once a year you had a test and you had to give correct answers, or I don't know quite how you'd evaluate whether someone has a reasonable understanding of the often difficult thicket of causal evaluations and which one is true and which ones are false on a given topic. But if you had referenda, if you had some sort of test that incentivized people to know more about the topic, either as a upweighting of their vote or literally as a financial incentive, then you may just be directly getting people more involved in this process. So all of these seem like ways that you could incentivize policy knowledge. So just to give concrete proposal, let's say you had a laudocratic system, they design a test, the test weights people's votes between 1 and 2 based on the percent of correct answers you get on like a 10-point test on a given topic, like should we raise the minimum wage, referendum. And then that test might include questions like, what is the current minimum wage, which is fairly easy, but also questions like Card and Kruger, 1995, what causal method did it use? Like fairly involved ones.
I find it really challenging to imagine that we could construct a test that would give people substantive enough knowledge to make good policy decisions, right? Because the realm of political knowledge is so expansive.
I don't think it's the goal of the test to do it. It's the goal of creating the incentive, and then people may be like on themselves. Therefore, they would want to get as much voting power as they can if they're committed partisan. So they would be forced to inform themselves. Like, in other words, let me flip the utopian proposal. You gave this idea of purely laudocratic system. So politicians stop lying to the masses. They stop taking fake popular positions. They stop pandering, right? Yeah. Well, the converse here is, imagine you have a world where there's either a direct financial incentive to get questions correctly, or 2, there's an upweight to your vote. Well, now politicians and the media that is partisan have a strong incentive to give you those correct answers. Like here's our answer sheet. We're going to go over the
Republican
answers.
Study Group.
Literally, yes, right. The Republican Study Group, but they're actually reading Card and Kruger 1995. Yes.
I can conceive of a situation where the Republican Party says, well, this is all misinformation. This is the bullshit woke system, but you still have to, lie and put these answers anyway. I don't think that's a non-possible outcome.
Sure.
I think another incentive you could provide people is just like a 1% income tax reduction. But then again, I think that would have an extremely low actually impact on Americans. Americans seem like look at Elon's $1 million paying voters attempt in Michigan. That seemed to have almost zero impact on the election. And I was really surprised by that. And it's just because I think people are like so unaware that they don't even pay attention to these things.
Well, so it's complicated. So I've wanted to write on this. It doesn't seem like money has a big impact in general on what's sometimes called the first face of power, meaning like elections and legislative decisions. Think of it as votes broadly. So whether it's the popular vote or the legislative vote, money doesn't have a huge impact. Lobbying doesn't have a huge impact. But the second face of power, so-called, think of it as like Fox News, MSNBC, the broader like creation of your positions and what positions are acceptable. Money has a massive impact there. Like the creation of media has like enormous impacts on what people believe. And there's so many studies to support that. So unironically, like Elon buying Twitter has done more for Republicans than any amount of money he's given in the elections by like 1,000-fold. Which does get to your point that there's a problem there, that you have an incentive to misinform people. But my argument would be that incentive would still exist, just weaker, because the more the population is misinformed and agrees with you, the more likely they are to enter these autocratic systems and vote for you. Like just to make this clear about like the size of the incentive, let's assume that the deliberation decreases the impact of misinformation by 2-fold. It doesn't, like, that just means the incentive to misinform is still half of what it was, but that's still a really big incentive, right? Like if you could shift the entire population by 10 points to your side, you've still got a 5-point advantage out of that. It just reduces it slightly.
I do think, though, in this system, the capacity to fundraise, to fund these kind of misinformation projects just goes down a lot. I think partisan identity is a huge driver of fundraising, like in donating behavior to political causes. And once that goes away, there's a lot of people that are not going to be donating anymore, right? There's also people who donate for access purposes. You can't really donate to candidates anymore in this context. So I think that it goes down. Of course, it's still present, right? Like, let's say I'm a malevolent billionaire like Elon Musk, and like I just have the singular goal of ideologically transforming the country in a bad way. Well, I still have a reason to do it. But the average voter, like my grandparents, they're not going to be donating to the conservative misinformation fund when the Republican Party brand is not next to it. They would just never find themselves supposed to do so, right? Like they donate because of the stakes, right? Because they're after Trump or whatever. And now that no one's after Trump and Trump's not around, there's no. I think that it goes down substantially. That's a significant benefit, frankly, because there's external non-political consequences of this misinformation. Look at all the people who are opting out of vaccines,
Sure.
right? In part because of this political apparatus. So yeah, there's some design features that I also discussed. The primary fixation of the paper was just on actually like spelling out a methodology for comparing different electoral processes, because surprisingly, in everything I read, almost no one's ever done that. The only methodology I found was what Bryan Caplan used in his book, The Myth of the Rational Voter, where he compares public opinion to expert opinion, which is a process that he himself admits is certainly not without criticism, right? Because the partisan political behavior and preferences of these experts is like really, really different, right? It's very liberal. So a lot of people would think that's a suspect methodology. I think my methodology is less questionable, right? Like, how could you say that people are making good electoral decisions if they don't have good information, right? Or they're systematically shown to be irrational when you use rationality tests and other things which are not political in nature. So that's the main focus. But I talked about some design things. For instance, I think leaning on candidates to present information, I think, is a great way to have more trust in the process, right? Because you don't expect candidates to present misinformation about themselves, and you don't have to worry about these nonpartisan or these mediators. But still, there's going to be some submission requirements, right? Like you cannot make unsighted factual claims or something like that. Now people can say, well, Micah, this is kind of hard to articulate. You can still have standards for the things that you articulate. We already have standards in courts, right? Whenever experts are presenting.
Funnily enough, you could even either create a separate or the same autocratic body and just ask them to evaluate, like, hey, did they meet the sourcing requirements? And like, if yes, throw it out. Like you could create like a mini sub body, a working committee, and be like, did they cite each of their factual claims here? If no, we're not going to show it to the other 900.
Right, right. There's a question of selection bias. I don't think it's a huge issue if you require employers to provide leave for people, unpaid leave, and then you compensate them very well.
Especially if there's a small number of elections, right? Then the number of people is fairly small.
Right. And also, like, you think about, people would like to be one of 100 or 150 people that are tasked with a very important choice, especially if it's something that's elevated within society. Now, we know that people struggle with jury duty, but jury duty is a much less glorious affair, right? Like, you have to hear all these facts about somebody's crime. It's less interesting than being one of the important, esteemed members of a body which selects potentially an important public official or set of public officials. Now, still, there will be some people that drop out. I suggest that you just, through lottery, select new people to replace them. If we see that there's demographic biases, we could use a stratified random sampling method. So let's say, we have an underrepresentation of working class people because 5% of the working class people dropped out, and that's more than other groups. We just randomly select people from the working class demographic pool, right? You can use like income tax records for things like this. Generally, I prefer just random sampling because there's a lot of variables that differentiate people, which you cannot split into your stratification process, or it gets really, really complicated, right? So you prefer randomness in a larger sample size from like around 100 to 150 people. It's okay if there's some self-selection. That self-selection is just the people that are more likely to be interested and invested in the process. And already the existing system is not demographically proportional. We see extremely different turnout rates amongst demographics. So all we have to do is better than the existing system to be, preferable in that capacity.
Yeah, I'll say two things on this. One is that I found that criticism of sortition both interesting, because it is interesting to think of like, if our goal is perfect representation, this will fall short, right? But then you look at like current turnout differences among age, for example, and you can get like a threefold difference between young people and old people. That's not proportional at all. Even if young people are 10% more likely not to show up to their sortition or to their jury duty, that might be better than the electoral system. So I found that criticism is really good if you've never heard of all the problems with the existing system, right? I guess the second concern that I had was it's actually about that random selection process. So in ancient Athens, when they had something like sortition, people volunteered their names, and then of those names, they would put them into, say, like 10 groups, and they'd select one group at random. That's a little bit harder to rig. There are other mechanical reasons for that, but I am worried in the modern era of how easy it might be to rig your sample. Like if you're the guy who runs this and it's your job to, like, you're the county sortitioner or whatever. Well, you can just keep running the random samples, like just keep iterating the seed up by one until you find the perfect population of people that would vote the way you'd want, right? Just like take your catalyst records in, figure out how everyone in this would have voted, what's their partisan lean, what's their ethnicity, what's all this. Oh, I just randomly happened to come up with a sample that's 80% Democratic. Whoops.
Ideally, first of all, the person would be selected via sortition, which maybe that produces a conflict.
Well, that's actually the question I was having. If they're selected by sortition, but they can choose the sortition process, it's the same problem you have with elected officials determining the voting process, right? So I was wondering if this isn't an argument for at least one elected position of the sortitioner.
That is an interesting proposal. I think you probably have some sort of like a constitutionally required system for random selection. Currently with juries, right, it's randomly selected based on residency. I think that we'd randomly select people from the voter registry, and that would just be a registry automatically constructed out of all eligible voters that are registered to a certain address in the area. And so we know.
I totally agree with that. I'm just trying to say, like,
go ahead.
Just mechanically, like, say you're in a program like R or whatever, you would just iterate up the seed. And yes, you're selecting randomly from that, but you could just select.
Well, it should probably be a public process.
Selection of that seed.
So it should probably be a public process. So like the day that we're doing it is like a public process where it's like the random selections like happening in front of you or whatever. I'm sure there's some sort of way in which you can make that transparent.
Yeah, I'm sure transparency and legal consequences would prevent a substantial bias in that process.
Right. I mean, now like what SL is saying is like, well, maybe it looks like you're doing a random selection, but you actually already randomly did it previously, and this is just a phony system. Now, hopefully you have a system in place where it's like they're not actually allowed to like reconstruct, like they're not able to mess with the code, whatever. So it just so happens to recreate a sample that you randomly constructed previously.
I did wonder if you wanted to do this the way that you do like election judging, you could just have it. So imagine there's still parties, right? Imagine this is not a fully sortition system, or it is a sortition system, but there are still parties. You could have it be that like different partisan members. So if you're familiar with like how computers do random number generation, let's say you just want to put in like a 5, like say it's 10-digit number. You ask the Democrat guy to give you 5 numbers and the Republican guy to give you 5 numbers. And if there's more parties, you ask for each of them, like 5 parties, each of them give 2 numbers. And you just put that in as your seed. That kind of thing would be extremely hard to rig. You'd need a cross-party conspiracy. So I'm sure there's ways to solve this. I just didn't know how much you got into those details, because this is my final question on this. I'm not aware of any existing like existing and binding sortition-based systems like this. I'm aware of a lot of advisory stuff, but I haven't found any binding sortition systems to point to as an example of where this works.
Binding is rare, but it's almost consensus that it's necessary at this point for the people that are advocates of deliberative democracy, because we've seen that advisory.
I want it to be binding. I'm just asking where it's been bound.
Like advisory sortition groups have been really remarkably ineffective. They've come up with amazing proposals, and just nobody ever implements them. Now there are permanent examples of sortition in the world. Like I think Paris has one of the few countries that actually has a permanent, or Paris, the city, is one of the few places that has a permanently sortition.
Micah writing from 1871
body.
Please go ahead, sorry.
Scotland has experimented with these a lot, and I think that some cities are trying to make them permanent fixtures. It's unclear to me whether like what their exact powers are. Obviously,
there's lots of permanent advisory bodies in American politics, and I think they're garbage. It should mostly just be destroyed. I would rather take a tenth of them being binding in some way than a million advisory councils that are super representative, put out great reports.
Like I think that the right way to experiment with this is you start with like a position that has extraordinarily low turnout and low comprehension amongst voters. So much so that voters really like the city controller. I mean, in Houston elections, turnout's below than I believe 2%. I mean, it's remarkably bad. And like I've told y'all in the past, like we've seen that voters have voted for candidates of the opposite party because of their name, right? So like in the last election, city council candidate, Republican, Twyla Carter, white lady, won the black vote. She literally won like 75% of the black vote. And you ask voters, and they actually thought she was like African-American and presumed she was a Democrat. They didn't know, right? You can blame them. You can also say like, yeah, like, hey, there's a lot of elections that go on. And
well, it's rational uninformation, right? Like the argument would be there's literally too much demand for on your time to get informed. Even if you want to be informed, it's hard to be informed on national politics in any meaningful way. It's really hard to be informed on stuff like who should be the comptroller.
People don't even know the at-large city council. Like, they didn't even know they were going to be asked to vote on this. So like they seriously don't know what it is. How can you be prepared for that? And yeah, this is rational ignorance. The idea, like, even if you had enough time, which you probably don't. Let's just suppose you did. It doesn't even really make sense in terms of budgeting your time to focus so much on politics, because the likelihood that you actually determine an election that has a substantial impact on your own life is infinitesimally small. Like the likelihood of being the deciding vote in a presidential election is substantially less than getting killed in a car accident on the way to go vote, right? And if you're thinking in probability so low, then you're not even going to go drive to go vote, right? And
to be clear, most voters don't take this view. They believe in like civic values. This is what Micah talked about earlier. Most voters think they're doing things for the benefit of the country, not because they think they have the infinitesimal chance of changing policy. So that's like a useful fiction, actually. I think we should promote that useful fiction. But it is true that I think one consequence of that is that because people are doing it out of a feeling of good for the country, they're not doing it out of like a sit-down process of thinking through the best policies.
Right. Like the lighter argument for rational ignorance is like maybe people don't cognitively process, oh, my vote doesn't really matter. Some people certainly think like that, but there's a lot of people who don't think like that. The punishment for being wrong in politics is almost zero, right? Like you go vote and you vote for the wrong person, and what happens? I mean, maybe some relatives don't like you, but there's plenty of relatives who do like you, right? If you have a wrong opinion about healthcare, right, you might just die because of that, right? If you're an engineer and you don't understand something about engineering, or you have like a completely wrong view about how to build bridges, guess what? You don't keep your job for very long, right? So there's real punishments for being wrong. There's not real punishments for being wrong in politics. So people don't have tons of an incentive to try to pursue what's right. We've seen that people are capable of overcoming their cognitive biases in contexts where there's really negative consequences for having those cognitive biases. But in politics, that those consequences are just not present.
At the very least, there's a high moral hazard that you are shielded from the direct impacts of your actions when you're voting, which is a bit tough. The distributed consequences of tariffs don't hit only the people who voted for Trump, obviously, right? So that's a good one. But anyway, well, any last thoughts on this mega sortition paper by Micah Irfan? I mean, I think in general, my thought would be that I like the idea of just expanding sortition to, like you said, a lot of those things that regular everyday people aren't really primed to care about as much. I think that also probably increases the quality of your votes for those other elections. Like, for instance, if you were to, like, let's just say that, okay, it's the Houston City Council election 2027. Instead of voting for like literally 60 or 70 different things, the juries take care of most of those things, and maybe you only directly vote for city council, right? And then city council elects a mayor, and then you have juries elect all of those other supporting positions. Well, then it's like, well, damn, I've only got like 10 people on my ballot. Like, presumably there would, hopefully you would expect people to be a little bit more informed, because even all of us, like when I go to a voting, I do the courteous thing and not vote in elections where I'm not informed on. But, I'm sure there's a lot of people that are just like clicking names when you see like, oh, precinct 7 local, XYZ school district election. And it's just like 3 names without a party affiliation next to it. It's like, I'm just skipping that election.
No,
I'm not voting in that election. So.
I will readily own up to that. For a lot of like very local positions, I like Google to see if they have a website, and I look to see if they have any things which is like do they have like I love God, I'm a MAGA Republican? I'm like, not so good. And if they have like woke stuff on there, I'm like, pretty good bet. Like, I don't know. It's unironically as stupid and satisfying as that.
Here's what I do. I've done, as like a good social Democrat, I vote Democrat, 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 Democrat. And then if there's nothing next to their name, skip it. Who cares? And then once you get to the referendums, tax increase, bond issuance, bond issuance, bond issuance, every tax increase, every bond issuance, I vote yes on, because I'm a goddamn social democrat. All right.
That's right.
Micah, what were you going to say? Sorry.
Yeah. I do about 12 seconds of research. Well, in the past I have for school board elections, because I haven't even known they were going to be on the ballot. And occasionally I've been exposed to elections where I literally had no idea who was on the ballot. And in primaries, that makes it kind of complicated, right? Like who do I vote for? And it's very easy to see bias in how people vote with low amounts of information. Now, something else I'll say on the sortition point is, if you really do think that the mediators are going to be partial, you can have a process that involves members of the public selected through some process to expose them to information, right? So in the British Columbia example I cited previously, a lot of the education on voting systems actually came from random members of the public. So members of the public could sign up to come and speak before them and present an argument for a position, right? Or submit proposals to the to the group, right? And like you can have processes like this which inform people in a way that's, all you have to do is be better than the existing system, right? And you have to be trustworthy in a way that can't be captured in some like dramatically terrible, awful way. I think there's applications of this idea that at least are worthy of experimentation. And I would say that if you ask me what my ideal system looked like, it would be a democracy by jury, or election by jury for judges, district attorneys, these kind of independent officials. And we'd have proportional representation at the city, state, and federal level. And we'd have a parliamentary system from there. And so you'd have distinct parties at each level that can brand themselves around the local issues.
Hold on, Micah. Have you come around to Supreme Jury? Have you come around to that?
Supreme Jury? Oh, like the Supreme Court being, well, I think it's interesting to have sortition amongst judges, like have rotating justices be the
I actually
court.
hated that one even more, because one of the benefits of the Supreme Court, for good or ill, is that it's fairly constant in its rulings, and so they're somewhat predictable. And if you sort judges,
I'm the real socialist on this panel. I'm the real anarchist. All right?
That's right.
Get rid of the
anarchist
judging
economy
philosopher king class and replace it with a jury of our peers. Micah, sorry, go for
it. I think that if you have a panel of judges that makes up the Supreme Court that's sufficiently large, and you assume that the variation in judge ideology is not dramatically like ranging in this sortition-based system, I think that makes sense. Like if you have like 50 or 100 judges that make
Micah would say,
so the reason
what Micah would say, let's make black people worth 3/5 of a person. That's what he would say. Okay, I say go all the way, get rid of the judges altogether. All right, all juries. Anyway, I'm sorry.
Very tiny point, just on the judgeship thing. I again, I don't really mind the idea of sortition for the Supreme Court. if you had a large enough population, but you don't, there's only like 179, I think, federal appeals court judges. Like the number of people is fairly small, and they're fairly high. Like it's an intensive job. They have a lot of demands on them. So the difference is that with members of the general public, you're sort of asking them to go from like your level of political involvement is voting on average takes 12 minutes, right? So you're asking them to go from going 12 minutes to spending like, I don't know, let's call it 5 days for how long it takes to do the sortition. I don't know what Micah's imagining for how long it would take, but let's say from 12 minutes to 5, that's like not a huge to ask. But asking a judge to go from like a full case workload to like also doing Supreme Court cases feels like you'd have to have just a lot more federal judges. And I'm fine with that. That's a different design.
Well,
than we currently have.
I do advocate having a lot more federal
Well, then there
judges.
you go.
I think the court system should move dramatically faster for it to be effective.
Okay.
Although I also think that we
I'll
should
concede.
limit. I think we should limit like litigation standing too, to make our society less litigious and implement the British rule. But
if you quadruple the number of judges to like 800 or so, and then you have the Supreme Court be about 50 people, such that you start to get law of large numbers start to apply, I'd be down. That's fine.
That's kind of where I'm at. I would say regarding how long the jury's convening on electing somebody, there's an argument which is like, Micah, this entire process sounds so complicated and expensive, right? How could you possibly do all of this? This is so difficult. I think people substantially underestimate how complicated a popular election system is. For these little elections that we have, there's a huge system of voting locations which must be overseen through a rigorous process to make sure that there's not any sort of fraud. And it costs a tremendous amount of money. And then you look at private campaign spending and indirect private campaign spending through the partisan political apparatuses. And you realize that politics is a multi-billion-dollar industry, likely more than that. And it's like the cost of convening juries of 150 people and paying them for even a month to deliberate on something is not that crazy. You know, a few of the juries I analyzed in my research went on for a full year.
Well, the question I was trying to ask is basically how many work days. So I know I'm interrupting, but how many work days of that year do you happen to know offhand?
What do you mean? Oh, like some of them were like full time. It's like it's really remarkable.
They were paid.
Yes.
So this is just equivalent to getting pregnant, is what you're saying. Like basically, they were like, employer, they're taking FMLA, we're giving them a $40,000 salary, and they'll come back in a year.
Well, yeah, and a totally plausible thing you can do is instead of paying them just a flat amount, you could do like what we do with unemployment insurance, which is like you replace 80% of their wages average over the previous 5 years or something like that. So like people have a real incentive, like this is way easier. It's like a 9 to 5. I get to make this important decision. And the employer is just like totally not allowed to fire them for this.
You know, it's funny now that you're saying this makes me, it makes me wonder as this gets a longer and longer duration of time, if you wouldn't get a bias against working professionals. Like the problem wouldn't actually be too few working class or whatever. It'd be that like people who have jobs and they're worried about career advancement would be the most likely not to come to increasingly long sortition, right? They'd be like, oh, well, if I take this for the next year, if I get my like government pregnancy of having to decide which electoral officials to birth, well, then I'm going to get a pay cut of 10% when I go back to work the next year, right?
I think there also, though, amongst that group, there is more of an interest in these kind of things. Like that's just my assumption, right? You look at the kind of people who go to like top schools, and they're like the kind of people who I feel like would be the most enthusiastic to be part of this process. So I think that these things could kind of offset each other.
Can I propose one less weird? So one suggestion here would be, right now, like one suggestion would simply be, what if you had, say, a 4-day work week? So you could still give people, you got your 3 days of weekend, but on Friday, sometimes this is the day that you can just be requisitioned by the state for these kinds of things. Like Friday is your jury duty day. It can just call you in. And so then you can work with it in a way that doesn't interrupt people's work. I know this is a very...
for some really high stakes stuff, you might need sequestering, which is you keep them fully isolated. Now, I don't think that we should use this process for anything that's that high stakes, because I think there's probably a better alternative. Like you should probably just appoint them at that point. Like I think having your president elected via sortition would just like create such a tremendous like opportunity for capture. It would be really hard.
One of the understated. So I mentioned this earlier. One of the big differences between this and the old Athenian system is that the old Athenian system was a 1-day affair. You signed up, you showed up, it was 1 day, and then you were gone. And the next day was a new selection, literally every day. So that meant it was very hard to bribe people. You'd have to bribe someone like the morning of if they got selected on a given trial, which is possible.
Hold on. There's a great example against what you guys are saying, and it seems to work out well. You know what I'm going to say? what about the Pope? Okay, it seems like they have a system. Nobody bribes anybody. They go into a room. The fucking betting markets couldn't even predict who are they going to elect. Like, I mean, you know, that seems
There
to work
was
just
actually,
fine.
I believe,
And that's the Pope we're talking about,
I
not
think
some
there-
measly president.
there was a pre-registered paper which did predict it, actually, funnily enough, just based on like number of connections and stuff. But
I find it interesting how bad the betting markets were on this. I mean, they've been pretty bad on some stuff, but they had this guy at like 2%.
we'll
Yeah.
never make.
Well,
I need to
obviously-
read something from the chat real quick. I will never make manager at the dog breeding factory if I get government pregnant.
Yeah.
I hate this
No,
shit sometimes.
Obviously, cardinals are like a radically not random group of people, right? These are people who probably all do take very seriously their vows of secrecy. So probably electing the president wouldn't work out quite the same. But
Yeah, it does help if all of your jurors are like sworn to secrecy by God. Yes.
yeah, well, obviously the Pope is just unique in a number of ways because it's like you're electing essentially the supreme leader of the country of the Vatican City, but then also the leader of an entire religious group of people. So I don't know, it's just not really comparable.
Pretty high stakes. Regarding the epistocracy point brought up previously, I have a friend of mine who's a big epistocracy fan. And I told him, well, why don't we just do lottery amongst the epistocratically like sufficient? And like then you just have like the ultimate system. Like,
Well, that's
highly
essentially what I was
educated people.
proposing.
Like-
And the question actually is simply how you do it. Like, do you do the epistocracy first and then the lotocracy, or lotocracy first and then epistocracy on top?
Well, I think that you do the lotocracy to create the epistocratic standard, and then that would select all future people. Maybe the jurors can like admit, like, yeah, like probably next time I shouldn't be selected for this kind of thing. I listen. I'm a big believer, just as you are, SDL. And like, whenever you put people and allow them to deliberate through a good process on a question for a long enough period of time, I have a high degree of faith that they come to pretty reasonable conclusions most of the time, and there's a lot of evidence which supports that.
I would phrase it differently. I wouldn't say it's most of the time. I would say they are moved, but I think that I think of it as a rate of change. Like how much information could you expose people to, and how much could you shift their opinions? It's probably like you could shift 10% of people in a day or something. Like just in some of these studies, the effect is on the order of facticity on persuasion is on the order of like 1/3 of a standard deviation, 2/3 of a standard deviation, which might mean like 5-10% of people shifted their views
in like a day, right? Like,
well, in one exposure in one study. Yes. So this might be greater than that, or it could be less.
Well, there's a lot of studies which show that like people at the end of the citizens assembly have almost completely different views than what they started with, and like the vast majority of people have that because.
And I'm totally willing to believe that, because it's like if it's an 8-hour thing, and if you're doing it, let's say once a week for an entire year, if you're doing it 52 times, you're getting 52 times the exposure of like what these studies are doing. So I'm totally willing to believe that. Yeah.
Right. So, anyway, well, that's my paper, guys. Go read out my Substack.
There it is. Micah's paper. He submitted it. I assume he got a good grade for it. I don't know how it works exactly.
I thought, was this like an undergrad thesis, or was this for a class?
It's an independent study. I didn't do an entire thesis because I started too late. A thesis has to be 2 courses worth, and it has to be like your fall and then your spring. So I said, well, can I just write this like really long thing and have to grade it? And they were like, yeah, sure. And then I got an A for it.
Did you use any AI tools to help you write it, Micah?
I think I have ChatGPT critique my grammar and my writing. It's a very useful writing tool. I agree with Tyler Cowen in saying that ChatGPT is pretty good at this kind of stuff. Of course, AI detectors are used all throughout my university now. So just having ChatGPT write it was not really much of an option. And if I did, I'd be much less open about my...
So if I open the paper and I Control F delve, we're going to be good here, right?
Like, just search for M dashes and you'll see
That's
that
right.
like a normal human amount. It's not used like every other line.
I hate M dashes. Just use 2 dashes. It's the correct number of dashes. That's it. Just use space dash space. It's correct. Never use an M dash. Never use an M dash. They're disgusting. They're anti-human.
My approach is I just go through, and if I have a lot of commas in one paragraph, I just replace one set of commas with M dashes. And then you just continue, okay? You just have to randomly switch things up, you know?
I hate this so much, dog.
All right. Next up, we've got our audience topic of the week. Patreon.com/the3wonks. If you want to say what we talk about on a week-to-week basis. This week, they decided by one vote Again, we use an approval voting system over on the Three Wonks Patreon because, of course, we do. We tend to endorse the approval voting system. They decided, what should we do about military and foreign aid spending? Okay, military and foreign aid spending. That's the question. Obviously, the Trump administration, they came out, they said, hey, this is our new budget. We got a lot of different spending prioritizations, you could say. And a lot of people say that we should spend more on foreign aid if you're a liberal and less on the military if you're liberal. Obviously, conservatives tend to say the opposite. So, what should we do, guys? That's the question. SDL's got to hop out real quick to say hi to his family. Understandable.
Just to
Pretty cringe to have family, to be fair. But
just to give a
yeah,
number
yeah.
before I go, I think one of the biggest arguments to me for increasing foreign aid is that the United States is a tremendously wealthy country. Sometimes papers will come out and they'll be like, the top 10% contribute 50% of global warming. And people will be like, see, this is the bourgeoisie being evil. But it's like, no, this is like half of America is in the top 10%. This is a fabulously wealthy country. The rest of the world is not fabulously wealthy. We can spend relatively little money and save millions and millions and millions of lives. So there was an estimate by the Center for Global Development on how many lives saved US aid does per dollar. And it's somewhere on the order of one life saved per $3,000. And like, I know people sometimes compare this to like the cost of a malaria net or whatever. This is like the cost of the life saved, not of the intervention, of the life saved.
Right. So it's a lot of malaria nets for every life saved. Yeah.
Yeah. So my point is just foreign aid is like a tremendously efficient investment from the US perspective on saving people around the world. If you think that dead people are bad and living people are good, foreign aid is generally a good bet. I'll be right back.
Right. So like there was an estimate that came out from a guy, Nicholas Enrich, who was used to work at USAID, and it was published in the New York Times. And he claimed that up to 18 million additional cases of malaria per year might occur and potentially 166,000 extra deaths. That's just tremendously negative consequences from what comes out to be really paltry cuts to the federal spending, cuts that are more than easily offset by the increase in agricultural subsidies and, offset multiple folds by what Trump's proposing in terms of tax breaks for the wealthiest in society. And it's like, even from a purely national interest standpoint, isn't this just great PR, saving lives around the world? I mean, if you want to restore it and brag about it all the time, look, we saved so many people from malaria. We're America. We're awesome. We're going to use this as leverage over these African countries to coerce their votes. Even if you want to be a real piece of shit about it, it's still worth doing for that sole purpose. So there is no standpoint of analysis that would tell you that the USAID cuts that we've made, by and large, to these substantial cornerstone programs were a good decision.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I find it very bizarre to, I don't know, on the foreign aid piece, I do find it very bizarre because, like Micah said, we're kind of on the, we're not exactly at the diminishing returns level of foreign aid spending. Like, it seems like we spend very little, but it has a very sort of extraordinary impact broadly. I think that's also in part because, when you look at, when you look at like how to effectively increase people's welfare, you have this sort of this diminishing marginal utility, I guess, of people's sort of happiness curves, you could say. And if you go to a place, some like very poor place, like Liberia or something like that, and you go there and you start to offer extremely basic levels of assistance, right? Kind of like what they were mentioning, whether it's malaria nets or certain basic vaccinations or basic access to healthcare or, infrastructure investment to like make the water cleaner, things like that. You just see like an extremely large return on all of that investment. Because, I guess it turns out that people don't need like an extraordinary level of luxury to live fundamentally pretty happy lives. And so cutting foreign spending is pretty crazy. In terms of how much we should spend on foreign spending, I mean, the answer, I guess, is as much as possible. But practically speaking, most countries tend to have between like maybe 0.5% and maybe 2% of GDP on foreign aid. I think I want to say Norway spends a particularly high amount on foreign aid. I think they hover around 2% of GDP. So, something like that, I think makes a lot of sense. And to Micah's point, obviously there's a selfish interest here. One of the reasons that China did their Belt and Road Initiative was basically just to engage in an international propaganda effort to try and get developing countries to not only be good export partners for their export markets, but also to try and to change the balance of power at the UN, because because of the United States' efforts over the years, a lot of countries feel either sort of obligated or in some sense loyal to the United States on a lot of UN votes. But the Belt and Road Initiative changed a lot of that, where you're starting to see a lot of developing countries be either neutral on UN votes or they start to take the pro-China stance. And so, engaging in that kind of like development competition is probably not only good for the countries that we're talking about, like, oh, you have this development aid from this country and this development aid from this country, but then also it's probably good for U.S. hegemony as well.
Right. And there's other benefits that we internalize, like whenever other people in other countries, when they're doing better, we actually have some benefits of that. Right. So like if everyone in a country is not dying from malaria, well, maybe they do some research, which helps us scientifically. Maybe they create some products, which helps us scientifically. Maybe we can have a better trade relationship with them, and trade is positive sum. Right. So there's all these benefits that we can have from other countries not being a disaster. Imagine if all of Africa had zero economic output, so did the Middle East, and so did Asia. That would certainly have negative impacts on us too, right? So
dead people generally consume less than living people, and they employ less, work less. Yeah.
So like there's this notion that like, oh, they're in another country, that their well-being doesn't affect mine. That's just simply not true. Now, somebody mentioned there's a PEPFAR USAID conflation that we're making here. PEPFAR is a big part of USAID, and there's other programs within USAID that
have to clarify what PEPFAR is before we. Oh, sorry, you might be about to.
Yeah, PEPFAR is the like anti-malaria program started under George Bush, which is one of the most effective life-saving programs that the United States has ever employed.
PEPFAR is the AIDS one. Sorry, that's.
Oh, it's AIDS. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
My mistake. It's one of the reasons why people say even though George Bush like did terrible things in Iraq, he might actually, from an EA lens, be a net positive president just because of how tremendously good that this program has been. And it's not the only program within USAID that helps people when it comes to combating global contagious diseases, right? And so there's like weird grants that we make to like the LGBTQ Resource Center of Athens for $30,000. Okay, you want to argue that we should cut that? Whatever. I don't really care about that much. I'm sorry to say, but I think insofar that we want to discuss foreign aid that should be cut, first on the chopping block is the stuff that hasn't been touched. That's like military aid to Israel, which I don't think is really necessary. That's aid to Egypt, right? I mean, my God, we've made a lot of ridiculous decisions with military aid in the past. For the people paying attention to the news, India and Pakistan have been fighting recently. At a certain point in time, we were giving military aid to both countries simultaneously. That's the kind of insane things that our country has done historically and continues to do in some part today. And that's the kind of stuff that we should look at for cuts.
The classic example also is like people like Saddam, right? Like just giving them tons and tons and tons of money and equipment so they can go fight someone else, and then they turn on us in the end. It's like, oh, this was a ridiculous waste of money that just ended up with like 1 million people dead.
Well, we funded the predecessors to Al-Qaeda so they could stick it to the Soviets, and then they ended up sticking it to us for a while, for about 20 years in Afghanistan. It just turns out that throwing weapons at people around the world is usually a bad call. Insofar you do it, it should be conditioned to them in being in a defensive war against an authoritarian power. Like I think Ukraine and Taiwan are like the unique instances where our foreign aid is unambiguously positive.
I think someone in the chat, Robert Ramson, said that what you said, Micah, about defunding like the queer study group in Brazil or whatever, that's dark woke, because you'd rather be giving the money to like the ultra poor. That is kind of like a dark woke position to take. Like, why should you have your rights to the first world while the third world people suffer? First world redistributionist dictatorship now to solve global poverty.
Well, there is an argument that the U.S. donating to things like this, like we donated to a PBS program for a certain country, like it was like an Arabic PBS program. I'm getting this wrong, but it was something like that. Mm-hmm. we shouldn't be doing that. But the argument is, well, this is actually exerting soft liberal cultural power, right? So if you can make countries around the world liberal, and what I mean by liberal is tolerant of other people, not authoritarian, not aggressive towards their neighboring countries, more favorable to the United States and the Western world, guess what? You save a lot of money because you don't need to bomb them later, right? They don't harbor terrorists or whatever. That's the kind of sophisticated foreign policy strategy, which seems to be like a completely outside of the ability of Americans to comprehend. That's the kind of game that China is playing, and to a lesser extent, Russia's been playing for a long time. But I've kind of given up on that project because it seems that any sort of building up to like future 4D chess global politics is something that can't happen in a country where every so often we might elect a complete ignoramus, which is more than willing to upturn every single positive relationship we have with a country in the world and completely switch teams, as we've seen with this president.
Well, all right. We've talked about foreign aid now, and that seems easy. I feel like our audience is primed to love foreign aid. But what about military spending? Obviously, military spending as a percent of GDP has been going down essentially ever since World War II, and now we sit around 3.5% of GDP going towards military spending. Now, a lot of people are offended by the nominal dollar. They'll say, "Oh, $800 billion budget, $1 trillion of defense consumption a year. This is ridiculous. This kind of nominal dollar needs to come down." I think the last president to, he didn't cut nominal dollars, but I want to say Barack Obama actually froze military spending for several years, which effectively cut the military budget because obviously inflation is a real thing. And I don't think Biden did many cuts. Maybe he did some real terms cuts, but I'm pretty sure Obama just froze spending for several years. But in general, how should we think about military spending? Should we increase it? Should we decrease it? Some people, I think every year the Greens presidential candidate says we should cut our military budget in half. I mean, should we think about something like that? What should we do with regards to our military budget?
I think if you wanted to steel man it, the strongest positions I've seen are that first, the claim that the United States spends way more than our peers may not be true if you account for basically the cost of living in the other countries and off the books spending. So it's much cheaper to employ someone in China, much cheaper to employ someone in Russia. So you have to do purchase power parity adjustments. You may even want to adjust it just based on wages. And then, especially in China, which has more state-owned industry, there's some level of military spending that occurs that's not literally on the books as military spending. So, if you don't do that, it looks like we spend something like 7 times more. And if you make all those adjustments, maybe it's 1-to-1. I'm not sure whether I believe. Go ahead.
Benefits for military members and their families is something that often is done in other countries through a broader welfare system. And for us, it's counted as related to the military.
Well, so if you're just talking about DoD budgets, right? I think that's the comparison here. You're right, but there is VA, there is other post military stuff, and that is handled separately. If you're just comparing the DoD budget to the Russian military budget, the Chinese military budget, there's a claim that that at least China is closer to parity. Russia's nowhere close to parity, but I don't know whether I believe all those because it requires you to make a bunch of assumptions about how much it costs to employ people and basically the productivity benefits as well. If what you're really trying to do in those adjustments is say, this is the power of the military and we have to adjust for the real power of the military in making these comparisons, I don't know that you're getting as much out of a Chinese worker for $15,000 a year as you are an American, right? That's not true in the private sector. Why would it be true in the public sector?
I mean, insofar as, I think that about $200 or $300 billion a year is basically benefits to veterans. I think we would all probably agree that, veterans probably shouldn't have many special benefits. Insofar as it's good for veterans to have universal health care, everyone should have universal health care. Insofar as it's good for disabled veterans to have disability benefits, everyone should have disability benefits, right? So it's not super clear to me that and obviously maybe there's some marginal things, for instance, I have a family member who told me that if you're a disabled veteran, you don't pay toll tags in Texas. That's a small little benefit that I think veterans get. Of course, I don't have a big problem with that, but when we're talking about basically having a decommodified healthcare system just for veterans, right? That seems very bizarre to me, and it's certainly not very efficient. And so that's one way to sort of, in some sense, lower the amount that we spend towards the military, because we would agree with just universalizing those benefits to the broader
But
population.
I think you need more inducements for people to join the military in that case, though. So it's not as much of an offset as you might imagine, right? There's many people I know that have joined the military for the benefits, right? One of the big benefits is being able to go to college and have it fully financed. People go get JD MBAs fully paid for by the taxpayer. Without those kind of benefits, a lot of people are not going to want to sign up for their 3-year stay in the military, right?
I mean, yeah, but I don't know that. I mean, sure, right? You might have to have certain things like we already have signing bonuses. You're probably
Higher
going to
wages.
qualify for. Yeah, you're gonna have signing bonuses. You're gonna have a lot of your living expenses taken care of for at least the time that you're in the military. There's a lot of people that are in the military who if you just look at like E1 to E5 salaries for people that enter into the military at a non-officer level, you'd think to yourself like, wow, those salaries are just radically low. But people in the military often have savings rates of like more than 50% because literally all of their living expenses, medical expense, like everything's taken care of while they're in the military. And if you wanted to have, like you said, a special pension system as well, because, just because you have a universal pension doesn't mean that you wouldn't have pensions related to where you work as well. Stuff like that would make sense. But obviously, I don't think any of us would believe in, generally speaking, it's like, well, we need this compartmentalized and distributively inefficient welfare state just to incentivize people to join the military. Like, that would be a terrible justification.
I'm just saying, like, as a matter of trying to lower our expenses, we're going to have to like whenever we universalize these benefits, you're going to have to raise wages or something like that to continue to incentivize military recruitment, because we're already having recruitment issues. But to provide my take on military spending, I think that I have somewhat changed my opinion on this. Under a Kamala Harris presidency, or even Trump won, right, where the United States had a certain foreign policy position in the world, you could say, well, it's a nuanced actor. It's certainly not unambiguously good, but it might be preferable to alternative global hegemons like the Chinese. But the character of the current administration's foreign policy is frightening, so much so that it's really unclear that they're actually in any way better than the Chinese. And clearly they're just becoming worse and worse over time. So why would you want, if you have somewhat of what appears to be a fascist regime in the making, why would you ever want to give them more weapons? You wouldn't, right? So I think you don't fund the military. The security apparatus is one that I think is more of a threat to us than the Chinese are currently. And I'm joining my leftist proletariat brethren and saying, fight the police state, okay? Dismantle the police state, because I think these are ultimately, it's more likely these weapons are used to invade Iceland and Panama than a defensive war against the Chinese over Taiwan.
That was some of the things I was going to talk about, is that many parts of the military are aimed internally at the United States, aimed at like surveilling our allies, aimed at a lot of these other things, which go beyond, like, insofar as there's a moral defense of the military, it's either defending other countries in some way, like Taiwan, or countries that are so evil they need to be deposed, like modern Hitlers. But the problem is that we're heading to be the modern Hitler. We're the country that should be deposed. If that's the goal you're looking for, you don't want us to be on peer with other countries. You want us to be like declining. So I think it's pretty hard to argue with that. If there's a serious risk that every 4 years the United States just keeps electing someone like Trump, who is like going to he's threatening to invade other countries. He's calling cartels like terrorists. He says he's going to bomb them. The more resources you give to that machine, the more likely that guy is going to do real harm. So I think it's very hard not to look at this and be like, hey, it's probably, you want to reduce the power of the United States in this realm because it's such a risky area to give such an erratic country that much power.
Well, we're talking about invading Canada, right? China is a super bad country in the foreign policy realm because they took a rock island in the South China Sea, like from the Philippines or whatever. I mean, that's not nice. You definitely shouldn't do that. They want to invade Taiwan. We're trying to invade countries that have nothing to do with us, right? There's not even like a claim. What's the claim on Panama? What's the claim on Greenland, right? And I don't think it's going to get better. I think it's probably going to get worse.
Well, yeah, I think insofar as what the United States could do is, instead of contributing money directly to its own military, you could say contribute money directly to something like NATO, where it's like more of a distributed power structure for how those dollars are spent and allocated. I think that insofar as we could internationalize militaries and things like that, I mean, that's probably just a better power sharing structure in general to prevent graft and corruption and things like that. I mean, it seems like conversations of, for instance, having like a European army have kind of picked up, not only in response to, well, I guess to be fair, essentially entirely in response to Russia invading Ukraine, not really because of this like concern about one country having too strong of a power, militarily speaking, but you know, that is one of the fringe benefits, is having this sort of a much more collective power structure over the military. That's probably better for the things, I guess, that you guys are speaking about, particularly because it is fair to say that, look, I mean, we have very bad democratic institutions in this country. You know, we have minoritarian institutions and minority rule a lot of the times. And, you know, at a certain point, does it become a sort of, you know, a more and more existential threat to have potentially a small minority of the population essentially dictating the entirety of our military budget? That's pretty understandable.
So I would take that position that I don't know that, like, I don't know about NATO funding. Like, you could make an argument Europeans should increase funding for that. Like, I think you could make an argument for increasing spending to Taiwan, which, you know, we have been doing, but they are the most plausible country which is at risk of a major military intervention. But the real thing, and this is a sleeper thing that goes untalked about, I think because a lot of people on the left and the center nowadays are anti-intervention, is trying to give the UN like $50 billion just to end war. Because peacekeeping really, really, really works. When the UN does it, it lowers it. The risk that the civil war continues is something like 40% of what it used to be if the UN intervenes, which still a fairly high risk. But when you're talking about like literal millions of people being displaced, I will take a 60% chance of that ending for like 30 years, right? So we are seriously underfunding peacekeeping operations, which kills me. Like, we're funding war in the Middle East. We're not funding peace in Africa. What the fuck?
Right. And like, people will say, well, you know, we don't agree with the UN's ideological tilt, but it's like, well,
their tilt is anti-war. Like,
most countries don't have a vested interest in war, right? Only the belligerents do, and usually only one belligerent is.
Well,
the one
I think also we have to keep in mind, one of the reasons why UN missions probably tend to reduce conflict is because if you're like a terrorist group, right, and you say, well, you know, I don't really mind attacking like the Rwandan national military because I kind of hate the Rwandan national military, fuck them, right? But if you have a UN peacekeeping force where it's like, fuck, if I throw a grenade over this fucking wall into this UN camp, like, I might kill like a German, an American, a Saudi, and all of a sudden I have like 13 different countries that are trying to fuck me up now, right? Well, yeah, no, literally, like, I mean, you see a lot of, well, no, I mean, you see crime organizations that actually make this calculus, right? Where it's like, we don't want to be, you know, like cartels will say, like, we don't want to kill Americans or kidnap Americans because we don't want to attract the ire of the American military or American intelligence groups, right? And similarly, if you have this sort of, you know, this very diverse sort of peacekeeping mission, it's like, well, fuck, like, we don't want to have 15 different countries that now are dedicating, you know, 0.1% of their GDP towards overthrowing us because we absolutely couldn't handle that. We're going to have to kind of like compartmentalize the violence that we're engaging in for that reason.
Right.
There's definitely some of that. There's just also a degree to which, like, many people in wars are rational. They do not like the risk of dying. They would take a job in a civilian sector in a well-functioning country. So if you can simply make that happen, like, unironically, one of my favorite proposals is, what if you just paid the militants to work in some dumb make-work UN job for like 5 years, training them how to do Excel or something? I don't care. Like, unironically, something like 50% would take that. Well, this is something we've seen in the opposite direction over and over in US invasions. Like, the story I tell is that we invaded Iraq and they had something like 200,000 people permanently employed by the military. We just fired them all. Well, and guess what? 4 years later, we got a civil war because you had a bunch of people whose only experience was in the military. You kicked them out. There was a global recession. They fucking hate your guts. You invaded their country. That's how the Ku Klux Klan was created. Literally the exact same procedure. So what if you just took them, you put peacekeepers in the area, and you gave them a nice cushy job in the civilian sector? That's all I'm asking. Is it too much to ask?
Or the idea of offering visas to Russian soldiers in like,
yes,
like pay, hey, come to the United States, like just import the Russian
army.
army.
Literally, yes, like open borders if you're a member of the Russian military. Absolutely, I'm totally.
I think it's a hilarious idea, but it's much better than killing people. I do think that there's a mode shift.
Might be cheaper.
like in foreign policy, and I think it's starting to happen, but like people need to take like a mode shift in how they view the US government, because historically we thought of the US government as like this albeit flawed entity which acts somewhat in the interest of the American public and in alignment with American regime values, which are like these pretty unambiguously good values like democracy, freedom, whatever. And that's always been suspect, right? Like George Bush used DHS to do awful things to Americans, to do awful things in other countries. But it was like, well, ultimately, there's some things that we stand by, right? We stand by this international rule of law. If Russia invades Europe, we're going to be pretty upset about it, right? Like fascist regimes, we're probably not going to be on their team usually, like unless, and if we are, it's going to be against communists, right? Like we're not going to be on the side of just the bad guys against the democracies. Like there's not going to be like good guys clearly and bad guys, and we're just going to choose the bad guys. Well, guess what? We're choosing the bad guys. If there's another, if a war against Russia and Ukraine happens again in the future, it's more likely that whenever we choose a side and JD Vance is president, we just choose the Russian side. We start sending them foreign aid. That's the kind of insanity that's happening. We don't live under like a government, a U.S. government anymore. You live under a proto-fascist regime, right? Like there's this quote from Stephen Miller today that I'm sure many of you all saw. He said, the Constitution is clear that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended at a time of invasion, so it is an option that we are actively looking at. For those who don't know, habeas corpus is the right to not be imprisoned unlawfully, the right to have a trial if you're in prison, to have a reason, a lawful reason for why you're being imprisoned. If they actually succeed in getting rid of habeas corpus as they intend to, that means that they could arrest any of us for any reason indefinitely with no due process. That is fascism, my friends. Okay. That's not like I'm just a resist live with my hair on fire. That's exactly the kind of stuff that this regime wants to do. Do you really want to give them more weapons?
Yeah. So, I mean, I agree with pretty much everything Micah said. I would only add more negative tone towards American spending beforehand. Like, I think we were more ambiguous in previous periods.
I agree. No, I think George Bush was bad, but it's like now it's like not even debatable, right? Like we are handing guns to not a government which fights for us, but is most likely to use those weapons against us. And the state is not our friend at this point. I think it's more of an enemy.
Well, and it's also just worth thinking, way earlier you were comparing our role to China. Something that I see a lot on the Stencer still is people who are sort of hawkish against China. And I get it. It's an authoritarian country. I'm not a fan of that. But then you look at their record of abuses, and it's like they keep threatening to invade Taiwan. Not good. They do some really bad stuff in Xinjiang, which is roughly comparable to the ethnic discrimination, mass incarceration we do in the United States. Not quite, but like there's some particularities to it. But like it's bad, but we do really bad things as well. And then you look at their other foreign policy things, and it's like, well, what wars are they supporting? Basically, like the Ukraine-Russia war. So if you were to attribute 100% of the casualties to China, like chalk that up in their balance, that would give them something like 200,000 civilian dead on their hands, something like that. We've got the same thing just from Israel-Palestine in the last war. Like we support really evil things, and that was even under a Biden administration. So I am just very not hopeful for the role of the U.S. military in the next like 2 decades.
Yeah, what we can hope for is multipolarity. We're not worried about defending our country. It's just not a thing.
Yeah.
And the foreign policy position of us is just clearly like whenever Democrats are in power, we will support the militaries of democratic countries in defense of wars, and we'll try to be a mediator in conflicts. But that's pretty much it. Any sort of power assertion, setting up new military bases, trying to prepare ourselves for wars with major powers, I think is just a major mistake.
Yeah, I think it's also clear that I think it's also clear that for the most part, the dynamics of war, I guess you could say, and the distributed consequences of war are so difficult to parse out that it seems like, to the extent that what Micah is saying is true, that the United States had at least a period of its time where, we were trying to promote democracy and liberal values and things like that. Even if that was the true intent, like it's clearly such a mixed record of success, right? Like certainly some successful experiments, but how could you really attribute that to the United States necessarily? Like some people, for instance, will say, well, look at South Korea. And it's like, well,
we supported every single dictatorship.
Yeah,
like,
exactly,
well,
right.
And it's more of a soft thing, right? It wasn't intentional. Like Taiwan, the rich kids of the Taiwanese dictators and like authoritarians came to America and they were like, it's kind of embarrassing that we don't have elections, right? Like it's kind of embarrassing, so we should try it. And then eventually they become real elections, right? Like it's kind of what happened in South Korea too. It's not really that the CIA is like, these institutions are not horizontal enough, boys.
No, I know.
The CIA
That's
taking a
what
course
I'm-
in like radical democracy. They're like,
Yeah. Exactly. No, but that's what
CIA
I'm
Murray
saying, right?
Bookchin.
Is like it's not clear to me that I want the government in general to be making decisions like this, right? Because it's not totally clear that we have an institutional framework that actually leads to mostly good outcomes, right? Like people use the example of Latin America, obviously very reasonably so, where it's like it seems like the United States had a truly paranoid level of fear about anything that called itself socialist or communist, and that led to a whole lot of oppression and regime change wars in Latin America, to the extent that if somebody were to come out of like living in Latin America in the 60s, 70s, and 80s and say, I trust China more than the United States, they're making a pretty rational statement in that regard, because their experience with the United States has been essentially entirely a negative one, whereas they at least probably have a neutral experience with China. And so in general, that's why, I would tend towards a much more humanitarian approach to foreign policy, decrease military spending, increase foreign aid, try to decentralize those levers of power as much as possible. Because it's just not clear that governments have a great ability to really pick and choose winners in geopolitical conflicts most of the time. Obviously, like Micah said, sometimes it's obvious, the Nazis during World War II. But when Chile elects a socialist president, it's like, God, guys, I mean, what is this?
We supported an Indonesian fascist regime which killed around 500,000 people.
maybe they're 200,000. It's complicated.
Okay, 200 to 5. I never thought SDL would be the one who tells me that I'm being too mean to the CIA.
We don't really have good records on it. It was intentionally like burned and destroyed and stuff, but 500,000.
So like enormous numbers of people, and it's my understanding that we were pretty supportive of that during the Cold War. I mean,
we handed lists over of communists.
We
would literally like, oh, you have like gangs going around beheading people. Here's a list of people we'd love beheaded.
If another country like China did that, we would hold it against them for forever. Now, obviously, we didn't mention previously the Uyghur genocide, totally unacceptable. The oppression of people in Tibet, totally unacceptable. It's just important to understand that insofar that we think the U.S. should be stronger, it's based on an assumption that America is going to be doing a better job than China. And it's just increasingly unclear that insofar that we'd have more military force behind us, we would be using it to combat the Chinese in any sort of helpful way.
So I do have a question. Is there an argument for... So military spending can be broken down into many categories. The military funds a decent amount of research through a variety of research labs. There's one for each of the branches, and each of them have sub institutions. Then there's like what you might call like basically something like half the military budget goes to contractors, like a very high portion of that. And one argument I have seen, again, from the Hawk side, is that it's good to make spending on that, even if we're not currently in any wars, even if the US is morally gray, because you want that capacity there in case like China invades Taiwan and you need to rapidly ramp up capacity, and then we could defend doing a good thing. And then conversely, they would downplay the risk that we're going to ramp it up to go invade Greenland. So is there an argument for like that sort of capacity maintenance as either a helping other countries defend themselves or a, I don't know how you want to frame it, but is there defense of that?
And I don't think we're defending Taiwan. I don't think it's going to happen. I just don't see, even under a Democrat, I don't see how it happens. The reality is the commitment you need to defend Taiwan is just dramatically larger than the one that we're even prepared to have, right? You need to have military assets in the region. You're fighting against the second most powerful military in the world with a very small fraction of your military who's not even immediately in the vicinity of Taiwan, right? A lot of them are in Hawaii. A lot of them are on the West Coast, right? Like, how do you expect to win a war in their backyard with such little commitment? You don't. And if you lose, well, then what the hell happened, right? What was the point of even being involved in the war? You're causing tremendous amounts of Chinese casualties, more destruction in Taiwan, and possibly huge American casualties as well, right? Like some of the military technologies we're talking about are like EMP bombs, which go off and just disable all the electronics in a very large area, right? That's hospitals that are losing their electricity, right? So even if it doesn't go nuclear, the human cost is tremendous. So I just don't see it happening. I think insofar that we're going to have a positive impact on like global democracy's defense, just give them weapons, because at least you know that they're going to use it to defend themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think to SDL's point, I'm not sure if you were asking a more specific question, but to me, I do think that the military, like part of what the military does that we kind of undercut with regards to how much spending we do is all of this innovation and research. Now, obviously, the innovation and research is focused on military defense, but there's applications of these technologies that go far beyond. I mean, I think like people will say like the internet was invented by like the Navy at some point, right? From military research grant, if I'm not mistaken, right? And so there's a lot of distributed applications to these kind of technologies. Now, obviously, people could just as easily say, well, to the extent that we have non-defense applications of these things, it should just be, sent to other departments. It doesn't have to necessarily be military research. But in general, to the point of what SDL is saying, that, well, you probably want to have an innovative military just period, right? Because you still want to have kind of a high productivity, kind of like very high efficiency military when it comes to engaging in conflict. That also helps with the personnel problems that Micah is talking about, because you just don't need as many people if you have a more sort of a more productive military, I guess you could say. But then also there's just a sort of like SDL was saying, there's just a sort of necessary inherency to wanting to be at the cutting edge of the value chain of military technology. So I don't know that is what we would necessarily restrict. I think a lot of what I would restrict is the kind of like operations of the military, right? It's like all these people who are sitting out on boats all over the country and, maybe like pulling back military bases or, things like that, where it doesn't seem like we would, we wouldn't necessarily want to have as much of an international footprint as we do now.
This gets to maybe a secondary related question. So I agree with you on the research bit. I just pulled up real quick the Air Force Research Laboratory. Like, what are some of the programs they're funding right now? And like one's titled Accelerated Aging of Spacecraft Materials, which they care about because they want to build military spacecraft, but also has potentially useful outcomes for the rest of society. Like, you go down the list, half these are just like military stuff only, and then half these are like basically aerospace related stuff. And I'm like, okay, well, at least some of this is good. But getting a little bit to what you're talking about, Econoboy, like we have a lot of programs we fund. Like we have something, I think it's like 600 tanks, like a ridiculously large number of tanks. And we're extremely unlikely to use them. It seems like if we get into any war where we do end up using the tanks, they're just going to get destroyed by drones anyway, like any near peer neighbor. So the only things we're going to be using the tanks for is like peacekeeping missions and ground control operations and stuff like
also
that.
Also looking badass, SDL.
And they do look badass, but we produce so many of them. They're currently looking badass in like a storage facility. I think in Nevada, there's just like 600 of them out there just sitting because we way overproduced them. Because this may get into the failures of our democratic institutions. It's a really strong incentive for people in each district to keep the military funding and facilities just going full blast all the time, because otherwise they lose a lot of money and jobs in their community.
Well, and that's why district-based democracy is stupid. like don't have districts, just like elect everybody at large. That's probably the right way to do these things, because insofar people are lobbying for earmarks, they seem to be relatively inefficient spending, or spending that would be better handled through a national process.
Yeah. As we come up to the 2-hour mark, let's just put some closing thoughts on this. I wanted to say, okay, so let's think percentage GDP terms. Look, what should we be spending, right? We already talked about how we would kind of categorize the spending and how we would reorganize it, right? Military spending more focused on research, less focused on operations. Foreign aid, just kind of like increased spending, generally speaking, on that a lot more. We've talked about the reasons why that is. So let's kind of think about the numbers here. I think that we spend about 3.5% of GDP on the U.S. military. I think we're at about 1% of GDP for foreign aid. That was before Trump, I guess. And so, what should we think? But before as you left SDL, I said we should probably spend about 2% of GDP on foreign aid. And then if we wanted to put like hard numbers on, military spending, to me, a lot of those categories of spending would be kind of like segmented away from the military. So the $200 or $300 billion, which is like, 20 or 30% of our military spending, that would just be universal welfare benefits. Now, like Micah said, maybe you're only saving half of that money because you have to have some more incentives for people to join or something like that. So let's say that we go down to 3% of GDP just from doing that. And then maybe for other things, like I would probably just hold spending constant. So you'd have real terms decreases for some, meaningful period of time, but you'd probably hold it at about, whatever current spending is for several years. So maybe it ends up eventually trickling down to 2.5% of GDP or something like that, just to put some rough numbers on it.
Yeah.
The thing I was mentioning earlier is called Sierra Army Depot. You can look up the pictures of all the tanks if you want.
Great.
I mean, the honest answer, it looks like the United States got down around to like 2% after the Cold War. Some European countries got down to like 1% or so. Insofar as the United States could do good things by supporting global peacekeeping, global policing stuff. I don't, whether that's going to be maintained, I have no fucking idea. But if you were going to do that, maybe you'd still want to keep it like 1 to 1.5% of GDP, especially if you're categorizing a lot of peacekeeping type operations in military spending. But like 2% seems like a clear target to try and aim towards. There is a caveat, though. Part of the reason our military spending is currently higher is because there's a war in Ukraine, which seems justified. So insofar as like the spending you're doing is resupplying other countries, which are doing defense against pretty evil other countries, it seems fine that it's temporarily elevated. So, currently the goal might be like 2.5% or even just down to 3%, depending on how much you want to give to Ukraine.
I basically agree with everything that's been said previously. I think that we should increase foreign aid. I think that regarding to the military, I don't think you can cut the budget dramatically regarding non-benefits, but like actual payrolls, everything like that, just because you don't want to, you're going to be losing a lot of capacity. You're not just making up for this in savings. Like you're actually losing a lot for the cuts that you're making because everything's already been built up. I think you can actually generate a lot of savings just with efficiency improvements. I think the DoD is one of the least efficient parts of the U.S. government. They still haven't passed an audit. I know they're making progress on that, but that's a problem. Like that's just a problem that you have such a big organization where we don't have full tracking of everything that's going on. And we already know that there's many cases in which we're being price gouged or we're administratively inefficient. I would see to it that we transferred a huge amount of military resources to countries like Taiwan and Ukraine. Just a huge amount. And other countries like Estonia and Latvia, Lithuania, which are the ones that are like unambiguously only going to use them for defensive purposes. And that's the primary way I'd see us downsizing, not so much like destroying equipment or just like selling it off to private contractors, but just transferring it to people that we know are going to use it in a way that might not be poor, like as we might use it. I think also in terms of strategic directional shifts, we'd want to shift more towards defensive technologies, right? So like anti-ballistic missiles are much less sophisticated in their capacity than ballistic missiles currently. And that seems like that's a bit of a problem. If we have China shoot ballistic missiles at us like crazy, we can't shoot them all down. And of course, it's more complicated to shoot down missiles than to shoot missiles at other countries. But that is our primary focus insofar that we think that the military's main justification is defending us.
Well, and the ballistic missile defense systems are a great example of potential price gouging because it's really unclear how well they perform because it's very hard to perform independent tests on them. They're extremely expensive and they're provided by, I think, like 1 or 2 near monopolistic providers. Like the defense industry is extremely concentrated. So there's very little betting. There's like very little competition on these contracts. And when there is competition, often we just keep extending the amount of money we're willing to give them up and up and up and up and up. So this is unironically an area where like you need like defense sector Lena Khan to solve these problems.
Yeah, no, true, absolutely.
Well, all right, guys, there it is. There's foreign aid and military spending. We'll see what the audience topic is next week. Glad to be back. We just had a bunch of stuff that came up all at once, but we only took, I guess, ultimately one show off, but we only record every 2 weeks. But anyway, guys, thanks for stopping by. We love to have you. And also patreon.com/the3wonks. You can vote on what we talk about next week. Audience poll is up right now, so be sure to contribute and vote, and we'll talk about whatever wins next week. Again, approval voting system over on the 3Wonks Patreon page, guys. So vote for as many options as you want. Guys, it's been great talking. It's been great catching up.
Thanks for joining us, SDL.